The US has apparently supplied Ukraine with a, quote, significant number of ATACMS. With these capabilities and other munitions supplied by the US, Germany, UK, and allies, will they turn the tide of war in favour of Ukraine after what has been a lengthy period of uncertainty, dwindling supplies, losses, and anxiety? Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please do like, subscribe, and definitely comment on the videos. Comments have been switched off sometimes for content that YouTube does not like. Hopefully, comments will remain on for this video because I know you'll be incredibly engaged with what my guest today has to say. Please do also check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. It has never been more important than it is now to help Ukraine towards victory and help it to remain resilient. Today I'm speaking with Anders Puck Nielsen, military analyst and influential YouTuber based in Denmark. He specializes in naval warfare and strategy, and in today's video, amongst other topics, we're going to be discussing the potential impact of the aid package that has just been approved and the news that ATACMS have already been delivered to Ukraine. Anders, welcome back to the channel again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Well, let's start unpacking this military aid package because it does seem clear that Ukraine, whereas it has not totally run out of munitions, it has been holding them back with the uncertainty about the potential supply from the US and Europe as well, especially with things like the artillery shells that were promised by Europe being delivered but not being delivered in the quantities and speed required. It does seem now with the aid package being lifted, Ukraine has felt comfortable to release the last of its stocks that has in supply, get them to the front, because they know that's now going to be replenished within days, weeks, depending on the capability. So what do you think is the importance here and the speed of reaction that we're seeing in terms of getting weapons to the front?
I think we're seeing how needed this is. While this is happening, we actually are seeing also some quite significant Russian breakthroughs, especially in the Donetsk region. So it really shows how important it is that these weapons get to Ukraine as fast as possible, and how bad the shell hunger actually was. So I think at this point, it's about getting these things in, you know, fixing the problem that basically was created by the West being so slow to deliver these things in the first place, but now hopefully filling the stocks and just stopping the accident from developing further. But it is, of course, true that these things will have an immediate effect, even before the American weapons actually get to the front line, because it means that the Ukrainians now know that more supplies are underway, and they can start using whatever they have.
And what do you think the implication of the ammunition or shell famine that you mentioned has been? The one that's always focused on, of course, is the incremental taking of territory by Russians. But isn't there also another factor here, which is Ukrainians have very good reconnaissance, so they sort of know when movements of Russian troops typically is taking place. But without the right kind of ammunition in the right place and the right volumes, they haven't been able to act upon the intelligence they've had over the last couple of months.
Yes, exactly. I think there's often this talk about a stalemate on the front line, and to a large extent, that is actually created by new technology. So very much in line with what we saw during the First World War, where this is often compared to the First World War. That was also new technology on the battlefield that created this very static situation. Nobody could break out of it. That was the machine gun, more precise artillery. Now it's the drones really doing that, and the fact that the battlefield has become transparent. So for a long time, we've seen this dynamic where the drones will identify targets and say, oh, the Russians are starting to move over here, or we have a big collection of forces here. And then you would have the artillery in place to hit that immediately. And basically, it took out that element of surprise from the fighting on the front line. And it created this very, very static situation. But what we've seen over the last 3-4 months is that Ukraine they still had the surveillance technology, they still had the drones, they could see the Russians are moving here, but they would not have the firepower to actually intervene and stop it. So to some extent, I think we can actually look at what has happened over the last couple of months and say we have maybe seen what it takes to break the stalemate that is happening here. It was that Ukraine lost the firepower to actually do anything about it, because the drones, they're just a fact of the front line. They're not going anywhere. So we need to find different solutions to how do we break that stalemate. And I think the lesson that Ukraine and the West should take from this is how important it is to create a shell hunger on the Russian side if you actually want to have success in pushing the front line the other way.
And ratios are something that's often discussed, but I think poorly understood. Ratios between sort of, killed in action on the Russian side to the Ukrainian side, ratios between the ability to fire shells. But what you're saying here is that actually accuracy is more important, and drone warfare is changing the game. Do we yet know whether drone warfare is likely increasing the capabilities defensive? That side in the war that is going for a defensive strategy as opposed to an offensive strategy, or are the tactics of offensive drone use, still evolving and being developed? Now, this might have some significant implications because clearly we know Russia will throw armor, it will throw meat wave attacks at defensive lines. And surely it is in Ukraine's interest to make sure the ratios of Russian losses are higher, in some ways falling back to defensive positions and this sort of combination of highly targeted artillery with, as you say, transparency. I know there's a lot of stuff to break down there, but is it starting to, are we starting to understand better how drones are affecting strategic decisions?
Yes, definitely drones seem to favor the defensive side. So and that it's already, when we have land warfare, it's already the defender that has most of the advantages. And then suddenly we have this very, very powerful new tool on the battlefield that also favors the defender. And that is why it's so difficult for both sides to get this big breakthroughs. And in the short term, I think this sort of mechanism will help Ukraine stabilize the front line, stop the current Russian advances, because now they won't experience the same shell hunger, hopefully, anymore, and it might not take all that much firepower to actually get the defensive advantage again. But of course, it's a huge challenge if we look ahead and say, how is Ukraine going to conduct the next counteroffensive? Because you're not going to win the war by just standing there and fighting the defensive fight. At some point, Ukraine has to start thinking about how do we advance in this environment. And clearly, I don't think there's much appetite to try what, the same recipe as last time, the counteroffensive of 2023, because clearly it didn't really work. The battlefield, the preparation was not good enough for that. So they want to do it smarter next time. But in general, I will say, I think drones, they favor the defender in many ways, or I guess we can call them a kind of denial weapon. It's a term that I have been using quite a bit, because if we include also what does this unmanned technology do in other spheres, like the maritime domain, for example, they really favor the denial kind of warfare, where you deny the adversary the ability to operate, but it doesn't really allow yourself to operate. You can just be kind of that spoiler with this technology.
And that, of course, is great where Ukraine doesn't have a navy and Russia does, extraordinarily effective. And I think that segues very well into the next question, which is, whereas you could potentially use the term stalemate for the last few months, and very much driven by the ammunition famine, also the deep defensive positions, the vast minefields that Russia has created, and the triple layers of defense. That, as you say, is very difficult to penetrate, and Ukraine is at a weakness if it tries to advance, because Russia also has drone capabilities. So you've actually got that limitation on both sides there. But what Ukraine has been able to do is in the absence of Western weaponry, it's been able to advance its own technology. As you say, the marine drones, extraordinarily effective, the sort of sea babies, so-called, achieving extraordinary things in the Black Sea, including recently, we went through this on the last video, taking out the Kommuna, a 113-year-old Russian ship, but ironically still quite an important vessel within its Black Sea operations. And then you have the long-distance drones that are starting to strike Russian oil refining capacity. So it seems that Ukraine has not taken this so-called stalemate lying down. They've actually been fighting, innovating, advancing where they've had the capability to do so.
Yeah. I think it's important that we understand that. I think the term stalemate is actually quite accurate of what we're seeing. It's just important to know that that is not the same as a frozen conflict, and that just because there is a stalemate right now, that does not mean that it is going to be a permanent situation. I think at some point we are going to see the front line really moving again. And to some extent, I think actually things have been, over the last couple of months, have been moving in Russia's favor in a way where I'm not sure really to talk about a frozen front line is appropriate anymore. But yeah, it is definitely interesting to see what Ukraine is doing with drone technology right now. How they are innovating, and it's all kinds of drones. It's the maritime drones you mentioned. It's the long range drones, where I think we're just seeing the beginning of this. I mean, Ukraine is still developing new types of drones with improved ranges that can hit far into Russia, and they will also be able to produce more and more of these over time. I think the problem for the Russians, it's just going to grow. Yeah, but it's also on the front line, just the kind of technology that, like these smaller drones, the FPV drones that hunt the vehicles there. It's really quite amazing to see how quickly these things are developing, and how the kind of technology that we used a year ago, or we saw a year ago, how that is just today, it's just totally different. It's different things that work. And I think we're just on the verge of a kind of machine learning, AI kind of revolution in this as well, where that might really change again the dynamics here, where right now there is a kind of balance on the front line between the drones that are kind of the offensive thing going out, and you have the electronic warfare countermeasures. But we might really see that tipping in the coming months, where it will be more and more difficult to use electronic warfare against the drones, because the drones have a mind of their own, and they can just operate independently.
It's AI, isn't
And
it? You're referring to a certain sort of self-contained AI
yeah,
uh,
exactly.
that's being developed and deployed.
Yes, you bring the drone into the field, and then at some point you kind of, as the operator, the pilot, you just tell the drone, okay, from here you take it, right? You may go in, you can identify here is a vehicle, you pinpoint the vehicle you wanted to take out, and then the drone goes from there. Or you can actually have one that just flies in. It's designed to find a T-80 tank, and it will go look for that and hit a T-80 tank. So these kinds of technology will really also change the dynamics again on the front line.
Similarly with the long range ones. Now, this isn't revealing anything. I'm not party to any secret informations. This is speculation, but it is entirely possible, isn't it, that your autonomous drone, even the long distance ones, may have a number of different maps uploaded, topographical maps, etc. And even if electronic warfare is jamming their signal, jamming GPS or something, they will actually have the autonomous information and decision-making capacity to figure out the lie of the land and take themselves into their target.
Exactly, and you can program it to know exactly what does an oil refinery look like, and what is the sensitive spot in this oil refinery that I'm supposed to go after. So these things are getting more and more smart. And I recently had a meeting with some Ukrainian soldiers that were visiting here in Denmark, and the message was very clear, like you need to wake up to this drone threat if you want to be prepared for war as well, because take it from us, this is this is huge.
This is why I know this is a little bit of marketing or PR spin at the moment that we're seeing from the British Ministry of Defence, but we're seeing more discussion about systems like Dragonfire, which, I mean, that would be an extraordinary military win if it could be deployed. I know it's at a very early stage there, and there's some very sensitive stuff in there they wouldn't necessarily want to put into the field at this point. But if we were able to deploy systems like Dragonfire at scale, this also could be a game changer in terms of air defenses. Because one of the problems we see, isn't it, is that we have relatively cheap drones coming in to hit Kharkiv, Kiev, Odessa, and other places. But the Patriot systems you're sending up are not necessarily that cheap per unit. Sometimes if they're taking the hypersonic missiles out, then the parity is okay in cost terms. But if you're trying to take out Iranian drones, your air defense is potentially a more costly expenditure than the projectile you're actually trying to destroy.
Yeah, yes. So you're referring to the laser system where you can actually take out these drones with a laser gun, and it sounds very sci-fi, but it's coming. I mean, this
Yeah.
technology exists, and in a few years it will be operational in many places. The problem, there are a couple of problems with it. I mean, one of them is the power consumption. Like they demand a lot of electricity, so it's not something you can sort of drag around on the front line at all. You can install it on a ship, or you can put it on some land where it has a connection directly from a power plant, or and another problem is the range. Really, it doesn't have a very big range, so you could use it for sort of point air defense. We say we use it to protect this piece of infrastructure, and it would be good for that, but it's not something that will provide cover for a big city, for example. So, but it's definitely something that, all these things are coming out, and we're going to have to figure out how to deal with drone warfare in the future. And what we're seeing right now in Ukraine, it's just sort of a glimpse into this. It's a moment in time. The technology on both the drone side, but also on the countermeasure side, it's moving so fast. It's really, from a sort of a military point of view, it's fascinating to observe.
Let's turn to strategy because we've talked a bit here about the problems of offensive warfare vis-a-vis defensive. Ukraine is potentially now for the next couple of months, hopefully even for the remainder of 2024, going to have enough munitions and capability to hold the line and have robust defensive strategies at least. But if we turn to a phrase which General Hodges likes to repeat a lot, victory is a factor of will and logistics. It seems that Ukraine's strategy to take out Russian refinery capacity is an important part of this concept. If you cannot have a highly mobile warfare at the front, Second World War style, if that is kind of done for now, and also you have two armies who are not necessarily that proficient at combined arms, and Ukraine does not yet have the air component that would make that a part of their strategy. It seems that actually hitting, striking, taking out, eroding Russian logistics is absolutely the best way to achieve a victory. And yet here we see a certain level of discomfort in Washington and Berlin at the idea of Ukraine hitting non-sovereign territory. If you put that in the context of the Second World War, it's of course absurd. It'd be like telling Britain that well, fine, you can hit France, you can hit Italy, but don't dare go after Berlin. Take the nuclear component out, it makes zero sense whatsoever. Do you think those red lines and restrictions are going to have to be swept away if Ukraine is going to develop a strategy towards victory based on taking out Russian logistics and I say economic capacity that powers its war machine?
I think that's definitely Ukraine's idea with this, trying to undermine both the Russian economy, the Russian logistics, but also the cohesion in the Russian society, the support for Putin's war, and basically to create conditions where Russians will go on the streets and protest about all kinds of things, some related to the war, some about whatever else. And one of the most important ways that you can create dissatisfaction in Russia would be to really hurt the economy, to drive up inflation. That's an argument I've been making, that going after the refineries is actually a very efficient way to try to hit the Russian economy, because if you can hit the fuel supplies, then that will really be something that can drive up inflation. I think the concern that we see in some Western states, countries like the United States or in Germany, is that, and it's a bit paradoxical, because on the one hand, they seem very committed to Ukrainian survival. They don't want Russia to win the war. But at the same time, I think there is a concern of what can happen if Russia suddenly loses too quickly. And this might be a strange concern when we're in a situation right now where Russia is actually advancing. But I think there is a sense that the Russian system is more fragile than it looks, and that things can suddenly become unstable. And there is a concern about what essentially Putin might do if he's suddenly fighting for his own political life, or even his own just sort of physical life in Russia. Because in that case, we might see suddenly the conflict expanding outside the borders of Ukraine, and we might see Putin reacting outwards, right? And so I think that has been some of the concern about escalation that we've seen from some European countries. They don't really want to say it like that, we're actually concerned that Russia is suddenly going to lose too quickly, because that sounds wrong. But I think that is behind some of those constraints. But you're absolutely right. From a military point of view, it makes no sense at all. I mean, and I think that's one of the discussions that we will need to have still. It's good that Ukraine is now being provided with ATACMS missiles, but if they can only use them in Crimea, then really it's still a limited effect, right? Why not open it up? Why should the Russians have a safe haven sort of on their side of the border? It does not make military sense, and it's a restraint that we're just putting on ourselves.
Especially as a lot of the missiles are launched from Belgorod Oblast, Kursk. You've also got Belarus, which is often left out of these conversations, but is still quite a significant, let's say, sort of aircraft carrier or launch point for many of the attacks. And of course, hybrid warfare. Now, I know Finland has closed its border indefinitely with Russia, and sensibly so, because the weaponization of immigrants and other tactics are something Russia would use. But there's a couple of things I think to pick up on there. Do you think, breaking down what you've just said there, do you think there are a number of fundamental misconceptions about what may happen in a weakened Russia? Timothy Schneider, I think, puts it very plainly, which is that Russia is not as mad or as fragile as we think they are. In fact, those two narratives are very much part of the propaganda ecosystem that is designed to constrain our actions. They want us to believe these things because it prevents, and very successfully has prevented, the supply of munitions, the right capabilities at the right time to Ukraine. This stuff has worked, and Russia has propagated these narratives. Taurus is a classic example, isn't it? And unfortunately, there is no sign of Taurus being delivered.
No, unfortunately, I don't. I mean, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, I don't think they are crazy in that sense. There are many restrictions on the Russian side, many red lines they would not cross, because it would be crazy to do so, and it would not serve any purpose. But my concern is really what can happen the moment we see the Russian society starting to crumble, if we see Putin fighting for his own political life, which might happen. I mean, this is definitely one of the scenarios for how this war is going to end, that it's going to end with a kind of collapse in Russia, which might be something that can suddenly create this thing on the front line where things can start moving very quickly. The Russian army just suddenly stopping fighting. That might be a consequence of turmoil breaking out in Moscow, those kinds of things. That we've seen that before. Again, World War I, that's kind of how that ended. So, and in that situation, I am concerned also about what Putin might do, because I think some of those red lines that are about the war in Ukraine, I'm not sure he would. I mean, I think he would be willing to do more and cross more of those red lines. Actually, I think he might be willing to cross all of them if we're talking about his own political survival in Russia. I don't think he really distinguishes very clearly between Russia and himself, to be honest. So if he himself is threatened, then he would very likely see that as an existential threat to Russia.
It's very Shakespearean, isn't it? The idea of the leader and the state embodied, and somehow it's also got a ring of death cult about it, Hitler in the bunker kind of thing, which is,
Yeah.
I'm going to take everything down with me. I'm not sure he's at that stage yet. And the scenario that certainly in Washington, Berlin is most feared is, as you say, popular unrest, chaos, disintegration. That, however, looks fairly unlikely because, there's this extraordinary strategy after the first mobilization of just letting people go, just, letting those who are most likely to protest and oppose the war, just get them out of the country, let them go and do their thing somewhere else. That seems to have been quite an effective pressure valve to reduce that kind of potential for popular opposition. Also, we saw with Navalny's funeral, they're highly surgical, highly selective in being able to isolate people who are likely to protest, take them out, make an example of them, and they seem actually to be fairly in control of that. Isn't it much more likely that there'll be some kind of coup from within the elite? The moment that Putin seems to be weak, the moment Putin, rather than taking the decisive measures you've talked about, fails to take the decisive measures, that could be a far more critical time for him, where either people who are sort of more Z patrioty move in to say, okay, Putin is not taking the tough decisions, right? He's gone, and let's get someone in there who will do that.
Absolutely. It's or it's a possible that it could be some kind of combination of things happening from the streets and things happening as a palace coup kind of thing. I think it was telling when there was the Prigozhin mutiny last June. It's really important that we remember it's not even been a year since there actually was a mutiny in Russia where the Wagner group drove on Moscow, and apparently nobody really stopped them. And we saw, okay, what are those people doing whose job it actually is in those situations to go in and stop this, especially the National Guard? And what they did was really, well, let's just wait out and see which direction this is going and whose team we're on, right? I think that shows some of the fragility in this, and why this system that looks incredibly strong might suddenly appear incredibly weak if those people whose job it is to control the riots suddenly stop doing their job. And so these things might go hand in hand. And I think the dissatisfaction in Russia is bigger than many people think. And not necessarily about the war. It's not because these people necessarily are anti-war, but then they're just dissatisfied about um, uh, things not working, infrastructure not working,
The
or
floods recently, with the floods of
the
highways.
floods recently. Yeah, I think also the terrorist attack on the Crocus City Hall was also an example of how the authorities were incapable of providing basic security for their own population. Also, we might come at some point where inflation starts becoming a real problem. People can't afford to buy food or pay rent, and all these things can just kind of tie together. And then you have people maybe going on the streets protesting about all kinds of different topics, but then once they're on the street, they might start agreeing on things. So things might, these things might suddenly start rolling. I also think there is a kind of delivery time on dissatisfaction about the war, the war losses, all the people coming home either in body bags or just, with all kinds of injuries. Over time, that is also going to accumulate and
Psychological trauma as well. I mean, we're starting to see terrifying videos of, Mobiki and Kontratniki returning home to villages and towns and committing crime sprees, threatening civilians. There's a terrifying one I saw yesterday of a contract soldier who's brought his gun back and is threatening a teenager with red dyed hair wearing an anti-war symbol, and he fires the pistol millimeters from her head while threatening her. You're going to be getting an awful lot more of this kind of crime spree based on returning convicts and people who are traumatized.
yes, you are. And one important point is also, if we look at how Russia is currently recruiting soldiers for the war, then they're really trying to not go too far with the forced mobilization, right? There was a wave of mobilization, but it's a year and a half ago now, and since then it has not been a lot. They're really trying to see if they can get people to sign up voluntarily. And to a large extent, they're doing that by giving big bonuses. It's an incredibly expensive way to wage war because you have to pay a lot of money to these people that do this. And once the economy starts having trouble, you don't have that kind of money anymore. You can't just throw money at the problem. And also, you're probably at some point going to run out of people who are willing to do that for money, because those who were willing to do that, they already did it, right? So I think over time, we're also going to see Russia having to use forced mobilization to a bigger extent. And that is also something that can spark the dissatisfaction with the war, or suddenly people, it gets close, all these stories about losses.
I mean, this is an incredibly important point you make, which is rarely discussed. People focus on the oil revenues, the gas revenues, powering Russia's war machine, giving it money to buy weapons from Iran, and one assumes China as well. But as you say, the human material they're throwing at the war is an incredibly expensive process, and the scale of dying means they're having to pay, high reparations to people for that when they do pay them. And there are rumors that quite a lot of those payments aren't going through. Having said that, there are plenty of people in the provinces, and a story that Taras Kuzia shared with me on the channel earlier in the week. This extraordinary story of a woman who sent her son off, or her son went off to war, died, and with the money that she got from that, she bought a house. The trouble is, the house turned out to be quite expensive to renovate, so she ran out of money, and then sent her second son off. So that she could eventually. I mean, this kind of story sounds sort of cliched, sounds like it's made up, but unfortunately, it's kind of tragically real.
But it also shows that this money actually does get to these people who
Yeah,
do that. So
it does. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And I have a little pause because I had a great question there and I've forgotten it. Yeah, but so dissent, it's questionable about whether there's going to be dissent. There's some ethnic dissent we saw in various ethnic republics, but again, they've stamped on those. They've sent FSB in to really stamp down hard on those. But there has been an interesting development this week. We've had Solovyov complaining in a way that perhaps would have been extremely dangerous to a few months ago, complaining that Putin is not being tough enough. I mean, he is not quite as direct, but he hints that the Kremlin is not taking decisive measures that need to be taken. That's quite a dangerous stance to take. He is still very influential. We've also seen Shoigu's deputy being arrested, and this is an incredibly senior figure. And people looking on the outside were like, well, he's been accused of corruption. Like, okay, he's corrupt. That's no big thing. But this is a system. I mean, this is systematically corrupt. everybody is corrupt. Everyone knows that everybody is skimming off. So if someone's being prosecuted, it's not an actual corruption process. It is probably indicative of internal power plays. So what's your interpretation of this? And could this be a sign of fragmentation, fracturing within the regime and its base of loyalty?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point that these corruption cases in the top of the system, it's never about the corruption because everyone is corrupt and you have to be corrupt. If you're not corrupt, you can't be trusted. It's it, they have to have something on you so that if they need to, they can start a case like that. And it is, of course, a part of a power play when something like that happens. And it looks like it is somehow directed against Shoigu because this was Shoigu's man. So it will be interesting to see also in the coming time, will there be a reshuffle of the government? Will we see new people in new positions? Putin has historically been very conservative about those things, not replacing people unless he really has to. But something might be happening now that he's about to be reinaugurated and start a new term as president. I forgot which term we're up to. um, it's definitely interesting that we're seeing these things, and I think the direction for the Russian government is going to be one toward more totalitarianism. It's going to be one where we're going to see the Putin government demanding not just silence or that you don't interfere, but actually demanding that you are explicitly loyal to this project that is going on, to demand that you're politically engaged for this cause, which is Great Russia and win the war and those things, which is a huge step away from what Russian society used to be. It used to be that you, as a Russian citizen, you could have a perfectly fine life as long as you just stay out of politics. Now suddenly you have to get engaged in politics. And it's going to be a difficult project for them to do that, but I think it's also going to be necessary if they want to make the war sustainable in the long run. But we should not underestimate how dramatic that system is going, or how that change is, and also that it's going to mean huge changes in the way that the Russian society works. And I think we are probably going to get into something that might in some ways resemble the terror of the past, these things we've seen, the fact that we today see just displayed on Russian TV how they torture people, for example, that they arrest. We saw it very clearly with the terrorists from the Crocus City Hall. Like they make examples out of these people, and they really do the brag about how they cut off their sort of body parts and what have you. It's this is the direction that Russia is going in, and it is probably a necessary direction if Putin wants to be able to continue this war and this regime in the long run, which obviously he does.
And this is the kind of, you could call it the opportunity phase of Putin's regime, rather than the sort of hybrid autocracy, which he's, as you say, run until the full-scale war. Let's turn back to Ukraine, however, because essentially, in this conversation I had with Taras Kuzia, we defined this in fairly dramatic terms as really the barbarism at the gates of Europe, and the things you've described there are utterly barbaric. Russia is also doing these things on the territory of Ukraine. It is abducting, torturing, killing, coercing people in eastern Ukraine and in the territories that it occupies. For the last 2 years, I mean, we've been talking about the need to have a concept of victory. We've talked about what is actually being fought for here. The freedom to associate, the freedom of belief, the freedom to organize and engage in politics without fear of death and torture. That is what Ukraine is fighting for. Do you get a conception that Western politicians are finally waking up to the genuine threat, the existential threat that Russia and its system mindset represent to our values and institutions?
I don't know. I think we have come to a point where the Western politicians have understood that this war is not ending anytime soon, and that it is a long war of attrition, and that it will require those investments in capabilities in the long run. And that has been interesting, because the whole counteroffensive last year was actually built on the notion that there could be a kind of Ukrainian blitzkrieg, very quick victory that would set a whole new direction for the war. And I think in sort of helicopter perspective, what we have seen, especially playing out in the United States, has been a difficulty in getting to terms with that. Okay, this is a long war. We need to make some of those long-term commitments in this. I don't think, though, I mean, even though we see now both Europeans and Americans seem to have come to terms with that and seem to have committed to the long run here, I'm not sure they really understand how significant this is going to be, and that it's not there is no turning back. We will not go back to where we were before the full-scale invasion in our relationship with Russia. I also think some of them don't understand how serious Russia is about winning in Ukraine, and what playing the long game will mean for Russia. I think essentially, there's been a lot of discussion lately, I've noticed, about the question of rebuilding Ukraine, and people starting to look beyond the war and say, how do we rebuild this place and make it prosperous once all this is over? What can we do now? I think we need to understand that if Russia cannot win all of Ukraine, which is probably going to be difficult, but it's still the end game. But if they cannot do that, then the secondary goal for them will be to turn Ukraine into a failed state, because that is a way to keep the pressure on Ukraine, to try to dominate Ukraine in a different way, and maybe prepare for another run in some years' time. So that's why I think, all these attacks we have on Ukrainian power plants, for example, it will take years to rebuild power plants. But I think the Russians are fine with that, because it is a perfect way to turn this country into a failed state if you don't have any power production. And I think we're going to see those things continuing. And I think we are seeing premature discussions about rebuilding Ukraine, because how on earth are you going to rebuild a country that keeps losing critical infrastructure? So in that sense, I'm not quite sure the European politicians or the American ones necessarily have quite understood how serious Russia is about the destruction of Ukraine.
And this is very interesting as well, because it ties into a question that I think we discussed more than a year ago, and with Ben Hodges as well. And this was the idea that Ukraine is going to be the front line of values that it shares with us, values it aspires to, and a power, a malignant power, which is very much minded to tear those values down and destroy them and undermine them. I think there's no question to that now. So it's not just a question of rebuilding Ukraine in terms of civilian economy. It's also a question, isn't it, of creating a massive and capable arms industry so that Ukraine is not dependent on packages of aid, so that Ukraine can manufacture armored vehicles, drones, missiles, and even more advanced equipment such as main battle tanks and so on, as well as Storm Shadow and similar kind of missiles with that kind of capability. We are starting to see some interesting trends there, aren't we? With alliances between Germany and the UK announced this year to produce artillery systems, and also investments, potentially British and German investments in Ukraine, in plant that will be located in Western Ukraine to build up military capacity. I mean, this requires not just large strategic investments. It requires a complete change of strategy, which is to turn Ukraine not just into a powerhouse tech economy, but an absolute military powerhouse, and a fortified area to essentially guard against a huge frontier, an offensive and threatening frontier, the defensive line between Europe and Russia. And that's not going to go away anytime soon.
Now that's true. There are several dimensions to this. First, it's important that we get this production up and running, just because all this military equipment is necessary. There's also the whole question of all these artificial restraints that are being put on weapons that the West provides. If Ukraine develops these weapons, then there are no limitations, and they can actually fight an efficient war. But I think you're also saying something that I think maybe also we have not quite understood in the West, and that is this thing that Europe will have to deal with their own security to a greater extent going ahead. The United States is withdrawing and refocusing on Asia. The Europeans will just have to deal with this, and really, it's difficult to rely so much on the Americans, especially after what we've seen for the last 6 months. But the extent to which, if Europe is to succeed in this, it is absolutely crucial that Ukraine is on the Western side in all this. If we end up in a situation where Russia actually wins and the Ukrainian economy, the Ukrainian people are turned into a part of the Russian war machine, then there's absolutely no way that we can balance against that. Right? The Ukraine has the second strongest army in Europe right now, if we count Russia as the strongest one. The Ukrainian one is the second strongest. It is much stronger than the British, the German, the French, all these. We need them on our side for our own security. And I'm not quite sure we also quite understand that dimension of the equation yet.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? Because we see them as allies. We don't yet see them as critical to our own survival. And we've been trying to make that point on the channel as well, that it's not just the military capability, but the whole process of Maidan and fighting back against oligarchy, fighting back against Russian influence, informational influence, political corruption. Ukrainians developing extraordinary techniques and culture to fight autocracy and oligarchy. I would argue that along with the military skills, we need those informational warfare skills. We need those civic society skills to also bolster our own political culture and our own techniques to fight back against what is clearly a malign and offensive empire in the guise of Russia and China. It has to be said as well.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Absolutely. So there are so many reasons why this is still very important, and it's also one of the things. I mean, I think these things are sometimes, it's not something that we discuss so much in the public discourse. We talk about the war in Ukraine being a long war, but not necessarily why is it so important for us. I think it would be a valuable discussion to have. But I would say I do think that in sort of the government corridors in Europe, there is a basic understanding of these things. I think that is some of the reason why we saw suddenly the French coming out earlier in the spring about this, for example. There is an understanding how important it is that that Ukraine actually wins this war. And it's also one of the reasons why I think what we're seeing now is that the Western partners are committed to this war in the long run. And I don't know. I mean, I could be surprised in a negative way here, but somehow I think that what we have seen playing out in the United States these last 6 months, that one way or another there is the commitment now in the West to keep supporting Ukraine.
Well, the last question then is this week, Rishi Sunak, after months and months of ducking and dodging the question, has announced that Britain will increase its military expenditure to 2.5% of GDP. That, however, is over the next couple of years. It's a relatively slow transition towards that. So, some people, including Edward Lucas and others, are saying, well, this is not nearly fast enough or serious enough, but at least it's a step in the right direction. What do you hope to see happening in European capitals over the coming months in terms of commitments to ramping up their military and production? What do you think needs to happen, and what are you hoping to see evolve?
I think we're going to see the European countries ramping up both their own military sort of budgets, but also the support for Ukraine. And I think both is necessary. I think the United Kingdom is going to end up in a situation where you have sort of been ahead for the last many years, one of the few countries that can say, well, we're above the 2% target. I think you're going to be passed by other countries pretty soon, and the United Kingdom will find probably an external pressure to move faster than that. I think we're going to see something in the NATO summit this summer where the 2% target, that was the target yesterday. Now everyone will move to 2.5%. And the UK being a nuclear power, global ambitions and all that would probably require more than 2.5% from the UK. And I must also say, I think the United Kingdom has been very good at, playing this game of being tough in the Ukraine matter. But I think if we actually look at the numbers, then I would like to see bigger contributions from the United Kingdom. It's actually not all that impressive if we look at the number of pounds that are being committed compared to some other countries.
So significant capability like Storm Shadow, interestingly, not limited by the same red lines, but as you say, in terms of quantity, monetary value, and scale, you know, we've been leading the way in terms of certain capabilities, like the Challenger tanks, but not giving the volume that necessarily would be aligned with a strategic victory for Ukraine. Is that fair to say?
I think it is, yes. I think when we look at the commitment in terms of money, and it's very good that the United Kingdom has played a vital role in being sort of first movers on some of these things and ending some of those silly discussions about red lines by actually just going ahead. But I think if we look at real sort of monetary contribution, how much money is this actually, then I think that kind of rhetoric you would expect maybe also a bit higher value contribution in that terms.
And let's hope France follows suit, because again, incredibly strong language, not yet quite backed up with volume and action, although they are providing aid through the, not in a sort of unilateral way, but they are providing considerable aid via the mechanism of the European Union.
Yes, exactly. And that's actually, I mean, that's kind of also the discussion I'm referring to here, because I think kind of unfairly, if we look at the numbers, then France is actually, depending on how you read it, but they are actually contributing more than the United Kingdom. But still, everybody likes to beat on the French in this because they haven't, played kind of quite the same role on the rhetorical side.
Well, let's hope there is a bit of a sort of, let's say, an arms race amongst European powers to see who can outdo each other. That's got to be to the benefit of Ukraine. Anders, it's always a huge pleasure speaking with you. And I think you've brought a tremendous amount of clarity to some of the issues that we've discussed today. And let's hope that politicians are watching this, and decision makers, and they move faster and further than they have done to date. But thank you so much, and thank you for everything you do on your channel. I know everyone's going to appreciate your insights massively.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.